İnsan kök hücre araştırmalarının teolojik ve etik sonuçları nelerdir?
What are the theological and ethical implications of human embryonic stem cell research?
Well, what are the theological and ethical implications of human embryonic stem cell research? And I've been privileged to be very close to both the scientific researchers as well as the religious responders over the years, and responders that are both Roman Catholic and Islamic. And I would like to share a little bit on what the derivation of human embryonic stem cells requires, and then why we ended up with such controversy, and also then finally what is the potential for human health and well-being of this kind of science. Just a quick review. It was in February of 1997 that Ian Wilmot in Scotland announced the cloning of Dolly the sheep, and some of the technology that he had used in that cloning was used again in the first derivation of human embryonic stem cells the following year, 1998, at the University of Wisconsin. Now, that experimentation was funded by the Geron Corporation, which invited myself and some other scholars to serve on an ethics advisory board in the middle of all of this research and the hullabaloo then which followed. Now, there are many different bioethical dimensions to stem cells, but most of the hullabaloo centered around how we get them. So, just briefly, in the petri dish, in the laboratory, you have in vitro fertilization, in which you fertilize an egg with a sperm, you shock it into activation, which is what Ian Wilmot did with Dolly the sheep, and that's routinely done now in stem cell research. And as soon as you get an embryo, that embryo begins to divide and duplicate itself into 2 and then 4 cells and then 8 cells, 16, etc. And then when you get between the 4th and the 6th day, a trophectoderm, kind of like a crust, forms around it. And within that is a large colony of totipotent cells. Well, they call them pluripotent. That is to say, these cells are capable of making any tissue in the body. So what the researchers do is they break the trophectoderm, they harvest the pluripotent cells, they feed it some nutrients, and they become immortal. They continue to divide and divide, and if you take really good care of them, they will go on. And in fact, the 4 cell lines developed in 1998 at the University of Wisconsin are still today producing more cells. So that immortalizing of the cell line was a giant achievement in science. So when you run into a molecular biologist, pat that person on the back and say, congratulations, this was really something. Now, why is this important? Well, because these cells are pluripotent, they can regenerate any organ, and we've actually seen in the case of a heart attack, human heart attack, where you've got damaged tissue, you place these stem cells, human embryonic stem cells, in there. They recognize that they're in the heart, so they become heart tissue, and they regenerate the heart so that it's stronger than it was before the heart attack. Well, okay, we're 24 years now into the research, and of course, they want to come up with therapies. It's been much more difficult but the theory is still strong. The evidence garnered is strong. And so I think we can still have some hope that in the next generation or so, some dramatic stem cell therapies will finally become available. What's the problem? Well, let's think for a minute like Pope John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI. Now, remember, in the 1970s, they were opposed to abortion. Abortion means the killing of a child before it's born. Do the stem cell researchers in the laboratory kill a child before it's born? Well, here's what Pope John Paul II and then Cardinal Ratzinger said. They said that in the mother's body, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, and you now have a conceptus, a cell with 23 chromosomes from the mommy, 23 chromosomes from the daddy, and then God imparts a spiritual soul. Now, for Roman Catholics and many Muslims with whom I've spoken, ensoulment becomes the ontological ground for treating a person with dignity. That is to say, you don't tear them apart to harvest their stem cells. On that ground, then, the Vatican's position developed in the 1990s, actually right around the year 2000, plus or minus, was no human embryonic stem cell research. It is forbidden. Illicit, actually, was the kind of Latin term that they use. Well, a few years later, the Islamic Organization of Medical Sciences, which then was centered in Kuwait, but involved Muslim medical people, laboratory people, theological people, decided that they wanted to provide a code of ethics for both research as well as what happens in the hospital for people. And they convened a few meetings at the World Health Organization in Cairo, Egypt. They invited me as a consultant while they went through their deliberations. And in short, here's the summary, and then I'll elaborate a little bit. Number one, no on cloning. Number two, yes on stem cell research. Well, what was going on? It was fascinating to me that most of the Muslim scholars really were sympathetic to the Vatican position. They really wanted to hold on to human dignity. They agreed with the Vatican that human dignity is warranted when you have an individual person who is ensouled by God. And this could mean that they would forbid human embryonic stem cell research. And that really was the view that predominated. Finally, when it came time to deciding what would be our ethical policy, one mufti pulled out the Quran. Ensoulment happens for boys at 40 days and for girls at 120 days. Therefore, according to the Quran, the disaggregation of the blastocysts between days 4 and 6 are not violating an ensouled embryo. And so the whole discussion shifted away from the Vatican position toward approval of human embryonic stem cell research. I found that very, very interesting. And as far as I know, what the recommendations then for laboratories and hospitals followed the protocol for approving of human embryonic stem cell research. Cloning, human cloning. Now, as far as I know, no human being has ever been cloned. The scientific community is not in favor of cloning human beings, etc. But that was a big controversy, and because the technologies for cloning and stem cells overlap quite a bit, it's just natural that you would discuss the matter of human cloning. And we did at the Islamic Organization for Medical Sciences. And it would mean that two persons would have identical genomes if you did that. Is that a problem? Well, Muslims, like Jews in Israel, Muslims take advantage of reproductive technologies and the most up-to-date sciences and that kind of thing. And quite frequently, Islamic families will have 10 eggs fertilized in vitro. 2 or 3 are planted in the mother. The rest go into the freezer. And if she has a baby, everybody's happy. We've got 7 fertilized embryos sitting in the freezer. Well, for non-theological reasons, there was a strong impetus to get the IVF clinic to donate those 7 fertilized embryos to science, where they would be used in stem cell research and destroyed. Why? Well, as the discussion went on, it became clear it had to do with inheritance rights. That, and this is sort of a holdover from the Genome Project, where we were talking about genetic determinism, genes determine who you are. And there was a fear that if those frozen embryos were to get out somehow and be implanted somehow, that a 20-year-old man might knock on the door of somebody and say, look, I've got your family's genome. I want my share of the inheritance. And so stem cell research was a good way of preventing an accident of that type happening. So those are non-theological reasons, but certainly part of the tradition that had an impact on what would become your moral stand regarding cloning. Where do things stand today? For the most part, your Vatican Roman Catholics still hold this position that was developed 20 years ago. And Roman Catholic bioethicists tend to really be sophisticated on these matters. As far as I know, Islamic bioethics has sort of settled into this position, and people are happy with that. I cannot predict yet how either Muslim or Roman Catholic bioethicists will react to the promises of transhumanism. I'd certainly like to find out. In the United States, liberal Protestant churches, which are pro-choice, that is to say that abortion is acceptable, also believe or affirm that human embryonic stem cell research is morally licit and acceptable. When Jewish people are asked about this, they affirm the doctrine of tikkun olam, that is to say that God's creation is unfinished, and the advance of medical research actually contributes then to the enrichment of God's creation. So there is no uniform religious stand. Oh, I did want to mention the Buddhists and the Hindus, because they're kind of interesting. They don't have a doctrine of ensoulment that establishes dignity like the Pope does. For the Buddhists, when you disaggregate the embryo 4 to 6 days, it is a life, but it's not what they would call sentient. To be sentient, if you're a Buddhist, means you are aware of your own being. You're aware of the tension between being and non-being. You don't kill a person like that. That's not true for the 6 days. So you're going to find Buddhist approval and Hindu approval of human embryonic stem cell research. So that's my story about that, Furkan, and hopefully you found that interesting. I know I have found it really interesting to be hanging around both the laboratories as well as these religious discussion sessions that have tried to respond to the science.